I had this concept when I probably in college and my young adulthood, where I thought about there was big love and little love. And little love was, interpersonal relationships, friendships, partners, etc. And your personal individual life. And big love was something about, a commitment to the world, to society, to your community. And I struggled with that because I thought, well, what do you prioritize and where should I spend my energy and where should I spend my time and my gifts? And what I finally came up with was that what I was looking for in my life was a convergence of the public and the private good.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Mary Gentile, who is the visionary creator and director of Giving Voice to Values, an innovative program that has transformed how people in academia, business, government, and beyond think about and practice ethical leadership. Mary has held many esteemed roles throughout her career, including the Richard M. Weitzer Bicentennial Professor of Ethics at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. She was a distinguished faculty member at Babson College, and during her 10-year tenure, that's hard to say, at the Harvard Business School, where she developed the school's first course on managing diversity and also co-designed its inaugural module on ethical decision-making. She is the author of Giving Voice to Values: How to Speak Your Mind When You Know What's Right. I've invited Mary to join this special IDG series because her work exemplifies the inner compass trait of the Inner Development Goals framework. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's great to reconnect. I think we met many, many, many years ago in California, right? Through some work
That's right.
university.
That's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the IDG framework defines the inner compass skill as having a deeply felt sense of responsibility and commitment to values and purposes relating to the good of the whole. And just sort of to kick things off, I wonder, how does that resonate with you, given all the work you've done over the years?
It was kind of interesting to me when I read the way you phrase or the way that particular inner compass goal is phrased. It actually reminded me of something I used to think about and worry about a lot when I was younger. I had this concept when I probably in college and my young adulthood, where I thought about there was big love and little love. And little love was, interpersonal relationships, friendships, partners, etc. And your personal individual life. And big love was something about, a commitment to the world, to society, to your community. And I struggled with that because I thought, well, what do you prioritize and where should I spend my energy and where should I spend my time and my gifts? And what I finally came up with was that what I was looking for in my life was a convergence of the public and the private good, the place where they come together. And that really resonated for me because I had this sense that that what made me feel good in the little love sort of individual way was when I felt like I was, contributing in some way to big love, to the larger sort of concept. And so my first thought when I read that was, oh, well, this is about my convergence of the public and the private good, that it's not simply about commitment and responsibility, but it's actually what gives me satisfaction, what gives me joy. Um, the other way I thought about that phrase that you just read, having a deeply felt sense of responsibility and commitment to values and purpose relating to the good of the whole, was the first part of the sentence, which is the part about having this deeply felt sense that you kind of know what the right thing to do or the purposeful and positive thing to do is. And that made me think of something else, which is, so that's sort of this idea of an inner compass in terms of almost a conscience, almost an ability to assess what's right. And that made me think about a lot of the work I do with giving voice to values, where when in my career, when I've been involved with the teaching of ethics, particularly business ethics, a lot of the emphasis has often been on deciding what the right thing to do is, and then you get into this conflict between things that appear clear cut, black and white, versus things that appear gray. And a lot of my work with giving voice to values is really about addressing that concern and pointing out the ways in which it is sometimes a false dichotomy. So I guess I resonated with the phrase in two different ways.
I love that. I as I'm listening to you talk, and I really want to explore the work of giving voice to values, such important work and so related to the inner compass skill set. The fact that the IDG framework is conceived as a set of skills that can be developed, I wonder if you could speak to sort of, us as human beings, the idea that we have an inner compass within us, and how does that actually get developed in us as people and as professionals and citizens of the world?
It developed as in being able to act on it, or developed as in understanding what to act on? I'm not sure I
Oh,
understood the question.
what if we do both? Because both sounds
Oh.
super interesting.
Okay, all right. Well, so giving voice to values is all about that first part, about how to act on it. Once you know what you think the right thing to do is, how can you get it done effectively? And we can talk about that a little bit if you like. But the prior question is about how do you know what the right thing to do is? That gets back to what I was talking about a moment ago. This idea is, are we focusing on, well, I'll give you an example. When I was first working on ethics at Harvard Business School, a lot of what we would talk about is, let's not focus on the clear issues. Those are easy. What we really should focus on are the gray issues, the issues where it's a little right, a little wrong, we're really not sure what to do. And I thought that made sense. I was an academic, and we were all about analysis and trying to figure these things out. But I've actually changed my mind somewhat. There actually, I think, are a lot of issues that are truly gray, and that are challenging. And I don't pretend to know the right answer to all of those things. And in a changing world, they become more and more complex. But nevertheless, there are a lot of times when uh, we actually do know what the right thing to do is, but at the same time, we're not sure that it's possible to get it done. And what we've begun to learn from the study of behavioral ethics and social psychology is that often when we confront those kinds of challenges, we don't sit down and do the analysis. We don't sit down and do the pro and con list, or think, what would John Rawls say, or what would Aristotle say? Instead, we react automatically, unconsciously, and then we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do, or why it was the only thing to do. And it's not we're not doing that consciously. It's not because we're trying to find a way to justify doing, the wrong thing or the easy thing. It's an unconscious process. It's self-protective to help us avoid living in that space of cognitive dissonance where you know something's wrong, but you do it anyways. Instead, our minds are protecting us from that. And so I actually thought that maybe what we needed to do was to develop an approach to working with ourselves and with other people, where we actually can short circuit or rewire that connection. If I simply give you a situation and say, Anita, what would you do? That automatic process kicks in. I don't want to reinforce that. And so I thought what we needed to do was to create a pedagogy, an approach to thinking about these issues that actually sort of leapfrogged over that process. And instead, it was this question of, what if you were going to do X and you believed it was the right thing to do? How could that be done effectively? The idea being, if you start to create a sense of more options, more choices, you actually can short circuit that automatic self-protective going to the easiest or going to the thing that you think is possible. And so I think that those things go together. That if you don't address the action side of it, you're actually going to be limiting your ability to see just the determination of what's right or wrong. Does that make sense to you?
It makes so much sense, and I have so many follow-up questions. And first, I want to get to the backstory of you and how you came to understand all of this and how you came to become passionate and sort of sink your teeth into this area. So you've spent your career exploring values and ethical leadership, and I wonder if there is a backstory that would explain why you're so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, so I was spending most of my professional career working in business schools and in MBA programs, graduate business education. And I often became involved with issues. I mean, I started out, case writing and managing a research case program at Harvard and things like that. But after a while, I began to feel a little frustrated. I wanted to do something that felt a little more meaningful. And I told them that I thought I was going to resign and look for something else. And they said, why? And I said what I just said to you. And they said, oh, okay, you care about that kind of stuff? They said, we're about to develop this new program around values-driven leadership, ethical leadership. Would you like to be involved with that? And so I did, and I got very involved with that, and I was working with them on that. And I became very frustrated. I became disillusioned. I had what I call a crisis of faith. And I began to feel that what I was trying to do over the years, I did this for a while, I was trying to do felt at best futile and at worst hypocritical. And I felt that way for a few reasons. The first reason I think is just because it seemed that every few years there'd be this spate of scandals that would hit the business press. And, when that happened, if you happen to be working in a business school, as I often was, we'd create some task force or committee and we would look at the curriculum and we would interview the faculty and the students and the recruiters, and we'd maybe create a new course or a new research project or hire some new scholars, and we would send out press releases, and then a few years later the whole cycle would start again. And I began to feel that we were just spinning our wheels. We weren't really making a difference on these issues. And then the second reason for this kind of crisis of faith was something more personal, which was that I guess it was in the late 90s. I had a friend who ran the Marcola Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University, and he decided to host a debate. And he was going to have two people on one side of the debate who were arguing that after 25 years of good faith efforts to address values and ethics in our business educational experiences, we'd made a huge amount of progress. And he asked me to be on that side of the debate. And then on the other side, he had two people who were going to argue we hadn't made any progress. And one of the people on that side was Milton Friedman's son, who is also a scholar. So I remember I sat down to write my notes or my response for this debate, and I had this moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because I wasn't sure what I could really say. I was supposed to be giving the positive side. So I ended up writing something kind of nuanced, where I said any of us who are educators or even just managers, mentors, parents, we know there's individuals that we've had a positive impact on. But if I were going to speak more broadly, I really didn't think we could say we had had that impact, which wasn't what my friend was hoping I would say, but it was kind of the best I could do. And so that was sort of a watershed moment for me because I thought, gee, I've been doing this for a while, and that's really the best I can say. But I think the biggest and the last reason for my crisis of faith was because of what I actually saw in the classroom or what I would see when I would go speak in companies to managers and executives. And it was this that, whenever we would have these conversations about values and ethics, we would typically share some sort of case study, some sort of ethical challenge. And people would read it before they came into the room, and then they'd come into the room with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. And then in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that people's thinking would become more complicated. They'd realize maybe they didn't have all the information, or maybe this is kind of standard operating procedure in this industry or this part of the world or this organization. Or maybe it is wrong, but if they tried to do something, they, aren't likely to be successful. They might even make things worse, at least for themselves. So their thinking would become more complicated. I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these situations naively. You want them to have thought through all those implications. But the second thing that would happen in these conversations was more troubling to me. It was that typically in a room with a classroom or in a company, there would be a few people that when they spoke, everybody would turn to listen to them. In the corporations, they were the executives. When I was talking to the military, they were the generals. When I was in a classroom, they were usually the people who were, the most articulate or maybe the wittiest. They always had a funny story. Anyways, those people were often the people who were expressing the most skeptical, if not cynical positions. The ones who were saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, this just isn't possible. And so I thought, gosh, the people everyone listens to are the ones who are saying you can't do this. Not that you shouldn't, but that you can't. And so I thought people were walking out of these conversations both more confused and less empowered. Well, I think I can use my skills in a better way. And so that was the motivation for me. I just decided I'm going to take a step back from this work. If I can't do better than that, I think I should. I've got some gifts, I'll use them somewhere else. And so that was really that pause moment that, eventually giving voice to values emerged out of that. And I can talk about that if you like, but it was really my own personal sense of frustration and a lack of efficacy.
That's why you're the most exquisite person to talk about this Compass work. I'm so excited, and I'm sure the listeners and watchers are like, okay, let's get to the giving voice to values part. But what comes up for me is I remember having a call with a mentor as I was making a very difficult decision. And the question she asked, I have asked now my students that I mentor and my friends that I mentor because I find it such a helpful question. And I think I want to share what it is and then ask a follow-up. She said, what two values are being held in tension that make this a difficult choice? And when you talk about the gray areas where it's not black or white, difficult decisions have to be made when values are in tension, right? I wonder when it comes to making ethical decisions as leaders in situations that are unfolding in real time where there's no real right answer or real wrong answer, it's a lot of gray area. What do you suppose prevents people? What are the actual blocks to making a full-blown ethical decision that in retrospect seems like an obvious decision to have made? Like, is it that people feel, is it a personality trait? Is it power that they feel like they have to defer to power as you've just described in the classroom situation? Is it that they're ambitious and they're looking for their own wins in a circumstance? So I'm just curious to, before we get into okay, well, what do we have to do in order to make ethical decisions? What gets in the way of those decisions?
And you're talking about times when people are clear, not the gray issues, but the places where at some level they know what's right, but they're finding it difficult to act. Is that what you're
Sure, let's
asking
start
about?
there. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the answer is I think there's all those reasons you started to enumerate can be true. I think there's many reasons why people don't do it. I think one of the major reasons is because is when you talked about it as power, it can be power, but it can simply be what feels to be the norm, what feels to be, the social consensus around you, what feels to be the way it's done here. And people have a strong desire to fit in for a lot of reasons, certainly because of their own progression, a desire to progress in the organization, but also just, as human beings, we're social beings. We don't want to place ourselves on the outside. We don't want to place ourselves in sort of a shunned position. There are some individuals who are a little more contrarian who may enjoy that position, but most of us would like to feel like we're kind of getting along, and we're accepted. And so I think that's a huge piece of it. And that can become more complicated. It can be tied to a desire to progress in the organization. It can be tied to even just a sense of loyalty. I feel loyal to my boss, or who's pressuring me to do this, or my colleagues, or my organization. Or in a nonprofit setting, I remember working with a faculty member in the UK who wrote a case for me for the Giving Voice to Values collection, and she called it doing bad to do good or something. So sometimes in a nonprofit situation, it's a loyalty to the cause of your larger organization that leads you to cut corners or do some less acceptable kinds of behaviors. So there are all of those kinds of reasons. And then of course there also are, simply my own sort of well, it's related to what I was just saying, but my own sort of progression, success, money, success, however you define it, whether it's simply an ego thing or whether it's actually resources. So I think it's not like there's one reason. There's lots of reasons, but they all kind of come together. And so part of what we're trying to do is to find a way to help people, I guess in your language, to weight their inner compass commensurate with some of those other kinds of pressures.
And I imagine these are playing out all over the place. I can extrapolate from the business context to the political sphere, in terms of, the dynamics that are playing out all over the world. So you've developed this innovative program called Giving Voice to Values. I'd love for you to describe it a little bit and yeah, share what the goal of the program is.
Yeah, so I tell people if they don't remember anything else about giving voice to values, and I might refer to it as GVV, if they don't remember anything else, the main idea is that it's about asking and answering a new question. So typically when we approach or address values or ethical questions, we ask, what's the right thing to do in a particular situation? That's a good question. It's an important question. As we were saying earlier, sometimes it's not even a clear question. But giving voice to, so I'm not saying don't look at that question, but that's all we would do. I used to call it the preach and pretend method. We'd preach to you about what's right, and then we'd pretend you could do it. And so what giving voice to values is about is asking this different question, which is once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how could you get it done effectively? What would you need to say? What would you need to do? What data would you need to gather? Would you need to reframe the challenge? What kinds of objections are you going to encounter? And then how would you address them? Who do you need to involve? In what sequence? In what kind of a setting? One-on-one or in groups? Do you need to build a set of allies? Is this a one-off situation or is it a systemic challenge? And if it's a systemic challenge, it needs to be addressed systemically, but that doesn't mean you can't address it. I can remember being in classrooms where students would say, well, but that's a systemic issue for this region, and therefore I don't need to deal with it. But in fact, systemic issues can and do change, but that's through a series of individual actions. And so if it's systemic, you need to think more incrementally, perhaps more long-term, more strategically. So giving voice to values is about asking and answering all of those implementation questions, pre-scripting questions, and then rehearsing and practicing. You're building what I call a moral muscle memory. I kind of got this idea from a personal experience. I was years ago, I decided to take a self-defense class, and I took this class. It was in Boston. It was called Modeled Mugging. And most of the classes on self-defense, maybe you've taken one, they teach you all the moves, fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep and knee to groin, and you'd practice them in the air. And the idea was now if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different, this model mugging class. It was developmental model. So they would teach you all those moves, but then once you knew them, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you remember those advertisements. And we would get lined up and we would take turns getting attacked by this gentleman. And then you could use all these moves you'd learned on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But as the class went on week after week, I might be talking to someone over here. He would come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what hold he was going to use. It was nerve-wracking. But the idea was that it was based on research from kinesthetics on specific state muscle memory, with the idea that if you've rehearsed something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in the moment, your body will remember. So, it's like an athlete will practice their moves over and over before they go to the competition, so that when they're there, they just naturally assume the proper form without having to think about it, even though they're under all that stress. So I'm in this class and I'm lying on the floor one day because I have failed to protect myself from this guy. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory, a default behavior, a default to voice, but not just to speaking up. People talk about speak up cultures now all the time. Often it simply means reporting. And what I really wanted to do was a default to informed voice, because I was also interviewing many, many people about times when they had or had not acted on their values. I was collecting stories in business settings. And, what I was hearing is that there were kinds of objections that people hear. In GVV parlance, we call them the reasons and rationalizations. They're predictable, they're very powerful, but they're not bulletproof. But it's very hard to think of responses to them in the moment. And so the idea here was to develop this muscle memory, this default to informed voice, so that you had spent time thinking through these arguments, and even though every situation will be different, the structure of the arguments is pretty predictable. I mean, there are things like it's not a big enough deal to worry about. It's not material in accounting speak, or it's standard operating procedure in this part of the world or this organization, this industry, or it's not your responsibility. It's, above your pay grade. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. Somebody else is handling these decisions. Or another one, which we talked about already, is just this, I call it locus of loyalty, but it's like, well, maybe this is somewhat problematic, but don't you feel loyal to your boss, your colleagues, your customer, your organization? And so they're powerful, but we started unpacking them and thinking about how might you begin to address them? What might you say? And we also wanted help people think about action plans so that your only recourse doesn't have to be reporting. Not that reporting isn't important and necessary sometimes, but what we wanted to do was to change the conversation in the organization before you got to that place where you're in a reporting circumstance, which by definition becomes more confrontational. The idea was, can we change the conversation so we never actually get to that point? So that people are raising their concerns in a constructive way and in a way that can be heard prior to actually having some sort of misbehavior, malfeasance that you have to report. And so the idea was, let's rehearse it, let's practice it. I started looking at research in psychology, in neurosciences, and there was lots of research that was suggesting that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, this kind of pre-scripting, rehearsal, practice, peer coaching in a collaborative setting, collectively, can be a very powerful way of changing people's both their skill and their comfort and confidence and likely to act. So that's kind of the core idea behind it.
Well, I love this because as I was listening to you describe the actions and the scripting, I'm hearing a lot of other IDG skills. I'm hearing that we need to have complexity awareness, we need to have intercultural competence, we need to have good communication skills. And the one that really sticks out for me is courage. And I initially was going to ask you whether or not courage is something sort of like the baseline from where you start. But then as you've been answering what giving voice to values does, I'm thinking that courage is enabled by all of the things that you put into place. Am I right to sense it that way?
Well, I love where you took the conversation just there. People will often say it's about moral courage. And I'm not against moral courage. I think it's a good thing, right? But I think it's a pretty high bar. And I think that a lot of people kind of disqualify themselves if they're to be honest with themselves when you say you have to be courageous. Some people find it, like appeals to their ego. But a lot of people just feel like, well, do I want to be that courageous in this situation? I really just want to get my paycheck. It feels like it's this very high bar. And so what I'm trying to do is what I say it's really more about moral competence. It's
Mhm.
about actually people building the skill, therefore building the confidence, therefore building the habit, and the likelihood that they will act. Not that you may not need courage at some point, but I don't think we have to immediately go to there. It's like going from 0 to 100. There's a lot of things that we can do before we get to that point. That kind of became clear to me when I was gathering stories, because it was so interesting when you were talking to people who were lower in an organization. And for them, a lot of the strategies that could be effective for them were less about courage and were really more about presenting themselves in a way where they were um, even often just positioning themselves as learners, or as people who were bringing the right people together, or as people who were talking to people who would talk to people who had the ear of the decision maker. There were all these different strategies that were perhaps less courageous and more just strategic and competent. And so I like courage. I think it's a good thing, but I'm really trying to get to the point where in these situations, we don't necessarily always have to go to that high bar right away. It's the same thing as I was saying earlier about reporting and speaking up. Sometimes it's absolutely essential, but can we do some things to not always get to that point? Because we know that once you get to that point, no matter what happens, it's going to be more challenging and often more costly for a lot of different players. Yeah.
So, does the work of GVV have implications for our personal lives within our relationships, our families? And if the answer is yes, given how much you've done around this, I mean, developing the program and teaching it, how has it changed how you behave as a person?
Well, I think one of the first of all, the answer is yes. And I'll just tell a quick story. I was in Abu Dhabi, and I was sharing this with a number of different companies and organizations there. And one of the gentlemen who had invited me was a senior executive in an aviation company there. After I was there for a couple of days, and after the first day, I saw him at breakfast the next day, and he said, I really have to tell you, I had this conversation with my father last night, my father who lives in Nigeria. We can never have a conversation without a huge conflict. He said, and I tried to sort of think about it through a GVV lens. He said, we had a really good conversation. And I've heard similar things from faculty who've said they were interested in it for teaching, but they've started using it with their kids, and things like that. So yes, is the answer to your first question. I think it applies in other circumstances. Personally, I didn't talk about this, but I have 7 pillars to giving voice to values, and they're basically just observations that I made when I interviewed all these people and gathered all these stories and started to think about, what enables the people who are able to do this. And I identified these 7 pillars, and the fifth one is my favorite. It's called self-knowledge and alignment. And the idea there is for people to think about how they themselves are most effective, typically, not necessarily about an ethical issue, but anything. Are you most effective in a debating kind of even confrontational conversation? Are you most effective in a teaching role or in a learning role or in writing or, in groups or one-on-one? How are you most effective? Are you an introvert, an extrovert, risk averse, risk taker, things like that? And then once you understand that, understanding how you can apply that to values issues. Often people think that if you confront an ethical issue, you have to, it's like this courage thing, you have to stand up, you have to take a chance, you have to take this risk, you have to put yourself in that kind of a confrontational role. And for some people, that's what they like and they're good at it. But for some people, that's a really huge barrier. I venture to say it's probably for more people a barrier. And what I found when I was gathering stories is that there were people who could do this, even if their personalities were more risk averse, introverted, etc. But they just framed the challenge in a very different way to play to their strengths. And so the way this has affected me, and I can share some stories if you're curious about how that plays out, but just personally, I realize that I am better asking questions. And so when I have encountered situations where I thought, okay, I'm on the table here, I have to resist this. I've found that asking questions is a way that I can be most effective. And so I've started to play to that strength because I can ask good questions. And I've found that when I would try and just argue and go straight at it, I was less effective. So yes, and yes.
So there are three things, three follow-up questions that I don't want to forget. One is I want to give you the opportunity to share a story because I think that could really bring the work to life. Second, I want to give you the opportunity to share what those seven are. People who want to read your book and get to know your work. So we won't have 20 minutes to do that, but maybe you can give a headline. But what I want to make sure I don't forget to do before we end our call is that earlier in the conversation, I was asking about people who are making ethical decisions, and you were in a situation where you know what is right or wrong. I want to circle back to what to do when you don't know what is right or wrong to do. What are the practices there?
Right, right. Well, so I guess first I'll just say that I remember a number of years ago I was working with a gentleman at West Point. He ran a program there. I forget what it was called, something about the Center for Character and Ethical Leadership, something like that. And he was responsible. They've since then renamed it and moved it to a different Army base. But at the time, he was designing the training programs for at the time, 1.3 million enlisted and civilian Army employees. And he was telling me, he said, I've been doing this work for a number of years. And when I first started doing it, there were a lot of issues that we would look at. They would identify cases and work with them. He said, but as the years have gone on, there seem to be more and more issues that people are identifying as gray rather than clear cut, right, wrong kinds of issues. And one of the things we were talking about is that when we don't think it's possible to act effectively, self-protectively, we start seeing the issue as gray. So the first thing I want to say is that there are a lot of issues that aren't as gray as we say they are, but it's not because we're lying. It's not because we're, trying to get away with something. It's a self-protective measure. And a lot of that grayness is because we just don't think it's possible. So I always tell people if what I hope they'll take away from this work is that they may have more choices than they think they do. So that's the first thing I say. But that said, nevertheless, there are issues that are in fact not so clear, that are, as you said earlier, two values in conflict or more than two values in conflict, or just really very, very challenging, especially these days with there's things that are new in our lives in terms of technology, for example. Um, and I think the thing that GVV does in those circumstances is it just helps us to think about more effective ways to communicate around values. Because as you're learning to express your values, you're also learning to be able to express them in a way that other people can hear them and perhaps present an alternative version. And we have a protocol of questions we ask people to go through when they're addressing a GVV scenario. And one of the questions has to do with understanding what is at risk for all the affected parties, not to do a stakeholder analysis, because I said earlier, these are situations where you think you know what's right, but to understand where there might be leverage, where you might be able to mitigate the risk that you may be asking the person to take, or at least acknowledge what you're asking of them. But when you're answering that question, in the course of answering that question, if it's a truly gray issue, you start to hear the other perspective on it. And so I think that this approach can actually help you make better decisions, even in situations that are in fact gray. So that's how I think about that.
Does that mean you're hopeful about our capacity to make the right decisions in the face of AI and climate change? Or do you think our capacity to do GVV work is being somehow diluted by the world that we're living in now?
I think it can be diluted in the sense that there's all this stuff out there that sort of moves in, but I don't think it disables us. It's really our choice. You know, I remember writing an article once about is there free will in business? Because so often I was hearing from executives that they had no choice, you know, and there was a whole argument, but at the end, basically the conclusion was free will is a matter of free will. So, you know, I mean, there are lots of challenges, and I think the challenges in some ways are greater because of some of the kinds of risks that things like AI can present to us. You know, misinformation, information, a tendency to rely on information provided through some of our AI tools as if it was, you know, the bottom line total fact when perhaps it's not, when it might be. We've all heard about the bias that can be in AI, but even beyond that, I was giving a talk this week at a hospital to a group of physicians, and they were talking to me about some of the challenges with AI was that AI is trained on data,
Mhm.
and that some of the best data in the healthcare field is protected. So those AI learning models can't get access to it. So they're often using data that is in fact unprotected, open source, which is the lesser quality data. That's not encouraging. And then I was reading another article where a number of folks were saying, folks who work in that field were saying that a lot of the available data has already been used to train our AI models, our large language models. And so now they're starting to turn to use what they're calling synthetic data, which is data that the AI mechanism, you know, algorithms produce themselves, you know. So obviously there are some challenges there, and we do have a tendency to sometimes it's you know our tendency to say, oh, I did the math problem, and so this is fact, this is true, even though it might not be correct, you know. So I think we have a tendency to maybe overweight the validity of some of the information we're getting through those AI tools, or sometimes we're getting it and not knowing that it was even produced through an artificial or technological tool. So yes, I think there's a lot of risk, but I do think that we have efficacy, we have free will, we have the choice to think about, well, what kinds of screens do we want to use when we're looking at this data? How aware are we making people of the limitations of the data? Obviously, these things can be hugely useful too. And so it's not that you want to deny that, but you want to help people to think about what are the screens. I worked with a gentleman to create a case for Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago, where he was working with an organization that was going to be using some facial recognition, and there were all kinds of potential challenges in the use of that data for bias and for inaccurate accusations of individuals. And you know, he said when he worked with this company, they identified a whole set of screening questions that people could use every time because their motivation was good. They wanted to increase the security in this particular organization. But these are the kinds of screening questions we need to ask before we adopt that kind of a technology. So I think we all have that choice. In a GVV scenario, what we would be doing is trying to identify what are the screens and then helping people think about how do I communicate about them in a way that people are going to want to hear it, because often people are just so excited about the technology, or you know they want to solve the next big problem. So you have to present this in a way that it doesn't feel like it's the land of no all the time. It can be actually acknowledging the value of what people are doing and trying to help them implement it in a way that it's not going to come back and bite them.
So we won't go down this rabbit's hole, but certainly what surfaced for me as you were answering that question is we need good, reliable information. Like misinformation and disinformation is actually
Huge
really
problem.
problematic. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we'll just leave that at
That's another podcast.
another podcast. Okay, so I wonder if we could marry the two things I said I would come back to, which is the seven pillars within a story. I wonder whether or not you could speak to a story and cover the seven pillars, or maybe they're separate. I don't know. I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, they're somewhat separate, and there's stories for each of them, and I don't think we have time for all of that. But let me just sort of go through what they are, and then if there's one in particular you want me to expand upon, I also, I discuss them in the materials and in the book. But the first one is values, and it's really about how are we defining values, because there's these two extremes where people will talk about total cultural relativism, and the other extreme where people will talk about universalism and, there's this set of, I know what's right and it really doesn't matter what you think. And we talk about how GBV addresses both of those extremes. The second one is purpose. The people who do this effectively tend to have thought actively and constructively about their own sense of purpose so that they can think about that as it aligns with or doesn't align with the role that they're playing in their organization. It gives them arguments to use. It also gives them personal motivation to act. So being in touch with that. The next one is choice, that I already mentioned, that there often are more choices than we think there are. Let's see. There's another one. Then the fourth one is normalization. This is the idea that people will often think about ethical challenges as the exception. They're working along, doing their job, they got their heads down, this thing happens, and they want to just get through it. So they may just sort of do what's easiest so they can get back to work. And the people that I spoke with who did this effectively actually found ways to think about these challenges as normal, as part of their work, as an everyday phenomenon, as they are. We have values conflicts every day. And when they normalize it, they bring the emotion down, they give themselves the permission to think about them and to come up with strategies that, as they would for any other problem, rather than it being this kind of exceptional deer in headlights moment that disempowers us and disables us. The fifth one is, and I have stories that illustrate all of this. The fifth one is self-knowledge and alignment. I already talked about that a little bit. I have stories about, people who see themselves as extroverts and risk takers versus introverts and risk averse, and how they found ways to work with that identity to play to their own strengths. The sixth one is voice, and it's simply the idea that this is something that you get better at if you rehearse it, if you hear yourself saying it, if you do it, which is the whole idea of GBV. People work in teams and have these conversations, and they're not asked to take a stand. They're asked, what if you were this person? We're giving people, I call it potholders. We're giving them a chance to say, if I were thinking this, if I wanted to act in this way, how could I be effective? And that tends to bring the stress down. People can be more creative. We know from the research. And it just enables them to, often the people who are the most skeptical or cynical are also people who come up with the most creative solutions, but they haven't allowed themselves to go there because they don't want to be suckers. And then the last one is reasons and rationalizations. And I talked about that a little bit already, that we try to identify what some of the predictable objections that you might encounter when you try and address these kinds of issues would be, and think about ways to unpack them, to reframe them, to respond to them, to sort of turn them around, jujitsu, to kind of help support what you're trying to accomplish.
Well, I won't go into this is not a political question at all, but I'll just use the example. I was watching some of the confirmation hearings of the, what is it
Cabinet.
called? Bondi, who's going for the
Oh,
top,
yes.
what is that in?
The Attorney General.
Attorney General, right? So she's the Attorney General of Florida, so she obviously, has experience in the job, but she was asked the very pertinent question of what would she resign if she was asked to do something unethical or plain out illegal. And her answer was along the lines of, I would never apply to a job where I felt that that would be even within the realm of possibility, which didn't answer the question at all. So that last one, the seventh one that you're talking about, I just wonder if you could share a story of where somebody really, what happens when somebody justifies doing something? What is the implication for the person and maybe for the organization if they're justifying and rationalizing a decision that they otherwise should have made?
Well, I mean, I think the easy answer to that question is that's how we end up with scandals, because people will often, they'll often justify making these kinds of decisions by saying it's either that or, and if you're at a senior level, the organization is going to lose money, they're going to lose investors, they're going to be out competed, their competitors are going to beat them. If you're lower in the organization, I'm going to be demoted, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose opportunities for progress. So, the easy answer is that, when people succumb to those kinds of rationalizations or use those kinds of rationalizations, you're starting down that path to having those kinds of challenges. What we try and focus on is, so how do you respond to them? So, for example, one of the ones that you hear a lot is, it's not material. It's not a big enough deal, we shouldn't spend time on this one. And so one of the things we try to do is to help people come up with ways to address that don't necessarily say you're evil for saying that, but actually help people see it in a different way. So, for example, with that one, you would try and point out to people that the very kinds of metrics they're using to determine that this is not material have been wrong in the past, so you kind of say, well, our metrics can be flawed, that's not a moral accusation, that's factual, and you can have data.
Mm.
Or people can say, yes, the consequences today and this are not going to be huge, but that's why this is the easiest time to address it. If we wait till the consequences are huge, it's going to be so much harder for us to deal with. We'll pay a much higher price. Let's do it now. It's easier. If you can make an argument for ease, that can be a powerful thing to do. Another thing that we try and do is to give examples. So if you have people will often use the negative example, which is kind of where I started, well, we could go down this path and there'll be a scandal. But what can be really powerful is if you have a positive example of someone who addressed a similar issue, hopefully within your organization, or at least in another organization that perhaps feels like a competition or close to your organization, to show that that actually was an effective strategy. And then when all else fails, to simply ask the GVV thought experiment question, which is, well, what if we wanted to do this? How could it happen? Well, you're not even asking them to commit. You're just asking them to think creatively about it. I remember when I was doing some work in India with a group of entrepreneurs who were telling me, well, it's very difficult to do anything here without having to pay facilitating payments, bribes, in order to get certain kinds of approvals and permissions. And, I had a story to share from an Indian entrepreneur who had been very successful and ethical in addressing that issue. But even before I shared that story, you can ask, well, but what if you wanted to, just what if, which kind of, it's not the same as saying, what would you do? Because then you're going to have all that self-protective stuff I talked about earlier, self-rationalizing and justifying kick in. But if you just ask, well, what if someone wanted to do it? Not you necessarily. How could they do that? So you try all those different strategies, and we tried to do that for as many of the different kinds of rationalizations. And then people always come up with even better ideas than we did.
Such a valuable conversation. And I still have two questions to get in under the hour.
Okay.
I want to ask how GVV you think can be useful for the meta frame of the IDG framework. The IDG framework came as a result of realizing that we were making very little inroads into addressing the sustainable development
Yes,
goals, right? How do we
SDGs,
fight
right.
poverty and gender equality and access to education and healthcare and all that and climate change? So how do you feel developing GVV and our inner compass serves us in wanting to create positive change in the world?
Well, I think for me, it's the only thing. It's the only way. Sometimes people will look at GBV and they'll say, well, it's focused on the individual. We should be looking at government, we should be looking at organizations, we should, and of course we should. But the only way we do those things is through individual action, I mean, change doesn't happen except, look at today, where we just heard that the Israeli cabinet approved the ceasefire. Well, that wasn't something that just happened in the cabinet, in the Knesset. I mean, it was all these individuals who've been negotiating for 15 months or whatever it was, and trying different things, often unsuccessfully, So, from my perspective, yes, you have to think, at that larger, broader level, but the only way you get there is through individuals who work in a smart, competent, effective way. And then obviously collectively they have to work together. So the IDGs to me seem like a no-brainer. It seems like, of course, you can't just preach to people to be sustainable, to be inclusive. You have to give them strategies for how to do it.
Beautiful. Last question, Mary. Thank you so much. I always end my interviews with an opportunity to circle back to empathy. And I wonder if you can think of a story in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Yeah, yeah. I was a little flummoxed by the question at first, but then I thought about something. So I don't know if I've already said this, but I'm basically an introvert. And I spend all my time now giving talks, so it's kind of a contradiction there. But I earlier in my life I was struggling with this, convergence of the public and private good, and I wasn't sure that I was up to it. Did I have the skills? Did I have the ideas? Could I do something like this? And so in the early years of GVV, when I was first kind of generating the idea, and nobody knew about it but me and a couple other people, I'd been working for months on research and all of this, and I just got stuck and I was feeling so insecure, and I thought, this is never going to turn into anything. And I reached out to the executive director of a program with the Aspen Institute. This was Judy Samuelson. It was the Aspen Institute Business and Society program. Her organization and the Yale School of Management underwrote the original book and project. And I reached out to her and I said, I don't think I can do this. I'm just stuck. And I remember we were on a phone call, and she just said, just just write anything. She said, just start writing. She said, don't worry if it's any good. Just get something down. And it was a little more than that, but it was basically this idea that I didn't have to feel like I was alone with the sense that I really had nothing to say. That she was saying, maybe you don't, but just put it down. And it made me feel like it was okay to keep going. And I'd been honest that, maybe I'd wasted her investment, and all of this. And she said, no, just keep going. And that was hugely important to me, to keep it going. And then the second one was when I was still working at Harvard Business School. There was a professor there, David Thomas, who was a friend of mine, and we were going to a conference together, and he offered to give me a ride, and he was going to be giving a talk, and we were talking in the car. And I was saying, I get invited to give talks all the time, and I often turn them down because I'm just so shy, and nervous about speaking in front of people. And he said, yeah, I know what you mean. And I said, you know what I mean? Because, I thought he was, much more advanced. And he said, well, I have this thing I do. And he was a religious person. I'm not, but he was, and he said, I think he would say a prayer or something, but basically he would say, and I try and focus on, help me to be able to give something useful to the people in the group. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I'm not a religious person, but I kind of came up with this little mantra where I would say, I'm going to try and do my best to try to be helpful. And that might mean that people hate what I'm saying and think it's stupid, but they'll hear it and maybe it'll trigger them to come up with something better. And so when I framed it that way, I no longer had to feel like what I had to say was brilliant or useful. It's just what I had, and I was going to share it, and maybe it'll trigger someone else to do something better and bigger, because it triggered something for them. So those two interventions were hugely important for me in terms of being able to actually even bring GVV out into the public. So.
And I love this question because I never know what I'm going to hear, but it never fails that my guests can think of times when acts of kindness, acts of empathy from others have made a difference in the moment and have continued to be a sweet memory right? Which I always think is the great gateway for me to say we can all turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, and let's just do that. So,
Mhm.
Mary, thank you so much for spending this hour with me. It was a wonderful, really rich conversation, and I love the work that you do.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it too, Anita.
Great. So, we'll see everyone next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.